In the tense years before and during World War II, Japan's naval leadership carried a deep-seated belief in its own superiority at sea. They saw the aircraft carrier as a powerful but limited tool, a weapon that only their highly trained crews and elite pilots could truly exploit. When American naval construction plans were whispered about in Tokyo, plans that hinted at dozens of new carriers, Japanese commanders dismissed them as impossible dreams. The Japanese Navy had spent decades refining a small but potent force of carriers, battleships, and cruisers. In their eyes, the United States might be large, but it was soft and slow to act. The very idea that America could build not just a handful, but 100 aircraft carriers, seemed like wild propaganda. Yet, across the Pacific, in American shipyards buzzing with cranes and welders, the impossible was already becoming reality. Throughout the 1930s, Japan's strategic vision for war was built around the concept of a single, decisive naval battle. They imagined that if conflict came, they would lure the U.S. fleet into a trap somewhere near the Philippines or the Marianas, using their own carriers to soften up the Americans before the mighty battleships finished them off. It was a doctrine born from tradition and reinforced by war games. Aircraft carriers were important in this plan, but they were seen as supporting actors to the battleship's starring role. By contrast, American planners were beginning to see carriers as the true capital ships of the future. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, and the battleships of the Pacific Fleet were left burning or sunk, the U.S. Navy's carriers survived, and overnight became the tip of the spear. Japan had meant to cripple America's ability to fight at sea. Instead, it forced the United States to double down on the one ship type it could produce faster than any other. Even before Pearl Harbor, American industry had been ramping up. President Roosevelt had authorized massive shipbuilding programs. The Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940 was the largest naval procurement effort in history. New shipyards were laid out, new techniques adopted, and thousands of workers, many of them women and minorities entering heavy industry for the first time, trained at breakneck speed. Where Japan relied on a handful of elite naval yards and a relatively small industrial base, the United States had dozens of sites along both coasts and deep into the interior, connected by rail and river. When Japanese officers scoffed at the idea of 100 carriers, they were imagining their own limited capacity multiplied by some factor. They could not conceive of the assembly line methods that American shipbuilders were about to apply to warship production. In 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had 10 carriers, including fleet carriers like Akagi and Kaga and a number of smaller light carriers. The U.S. Navy at that time had only 7 carriers, and many of them were older designs. On paper, Japan had the advantage. Yet American shipyards were already working on Essex-class carriers, large, fast, and capable of carrying more planes than any Japanese carrier afloat. In addition, the U.S. had begun building small escort carriers by converting merchant hulls into flat-decked aircraft platforms. These would become the unsung workhorses of the Pacific and Atlantic Wars. Each escort carrier might not match a Japanese fleet carrier individually, but together, in swarms, they provided the air cover and striking power needed for amphibious landings, convoy protection, and anti-submarine warfare. This was a concept totally foreign to Japan's admirals, who prized quality and elite crews over mass production and numbers. The American industrial machine shifted into high gear after Pearl Harbor. Shipyards like Newport News, Brooklyn Navy Yard, and Mare Island became 24-hour operations. Welding replaced rivets. Prefabricated sections allowed hulls to be assembled like giant kits. Thousands of new workers poured in, many trained in weeks for tasks that once required years of apprenticeship. As the first Essex-class carriers slid down the ways in 1942 and 1943, Japanese intelligence began to notice, but their reports were still met with disbelief. The idea that America could launch multiple full-sized carriers in a single year seemed absurd. Yet by 1944, the U.S. Navy was commissioning Essex-class carriers at a rate Japan could not match even for destroyers. For the Japanese commanders steeped in decades of naval tradition, the carrier had been a symbol of prestige and national skill. They could not believe that it could also be treated as a mass-produced weapon like tanks or trucks. This miscalculation lay at the heart of their strategic blind spot. They underestimated not only America's capacity to build ships but also its ability to train air crews, develop logistics, and supply thousands of aircraft to fill those decks. By 1943, while Japan struggled to replace its losses from Midway and the Solomon Islands, the United States had more planes and pilots than it had decks to put them on. This imbalance would only grow as the war ground on. Meanwhile, American political and military leaders understood that time was their greatest weapon. They knew they could not match Japan's early war experience in carrier operations, but they could overwhelm Japan with material. Each new carrier launched represented not just a ship but a floating airbase capable of projecting power hundreds of miles from its task force. Each new escort carrier meant safer supply lines, more effective amphibious assaults, and more pressure on Japanese submarines and island garrisons. It was an industrial form of warfare Japan had never fought before, and it was happening at a scale the world had never seen. By the time the first big wave of new American carriers was arriving in the Pacific, Japanese commanders began to sense the shift. Their reconnaissance flights reported more and more American task forces, each with carriers at their heart. Yet still, many senior officers clung to the belief that the Americans could not sustain such a pace. Surely the U.S. Navy would run out of pilots, aircraft, or fuel. Surely the industrial base would choke under the strain. But back in the States, the opposite was happening. Productivity was increasing, not slowing. The Liberty ship program had already shown that America could mass-produce merchant vessels faster than submarines could sink them. Now the same spirit was being applied to the carrier fleet. The psychological gap between expectation and reality widened. Japanese naval planners in 1942 and 1943 still envisioned a climactic battle, another Pearl Harbor in reverse, perhaps off the Marianas or the Philippines, that would cripple the American fleet and force a negotiated peace. But with every month that passed, the U.S. Navy grew stronger and more numerous. By the time that climactic battles did occur at places like the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, the Americans would not have just a few carriers, but whole task groups of them, supported by destroyers, cruisers, battleships, and an endless supply of aircraft. In essence, Japan's naval strategy was locked in the past while the U.S. was inventing the future on the fly. Thus, in the early phase of the Pacific War, while Japanese commanders scoffed at the notion of 100 carriers, American shipyards were laying the keels, welding the plates, and assembling the power that would eventually roll across the Pacific like a tide. The stage was set for one of history's greatest industrial military reversals, and the Japanese admirals who once laughed at American ambitions would soon be staring through their binoculars at an ocean filled with flat-topped warships bearing the white star of the U.S. Navy. As 1942 gave way to 1943, the war in the Pacific began to shift from a Japanese offensive to a grinding struggle for control of key islands and sea lanes. At the outset, Japan's carriers and pilots had ruled the skies, striking fear into every Allied commander. But beneath the waves and across the shipyards of America, a revolution in naval power was quietly taking shape. Every month, more keels were laid, more hulls assembled, and more flight decks prepared to take on squadrons of aircraft. Japanese naval intelligence kept trying to measure this surge, but their estimates always fell short of the reality. They sent coded reports to Tokyo describing new American carriers sighted in the Atlantic and Pacific. High command acknowledged these reports, but many senior officers still believed the Americans were bluffing or exaggerating. In their minds, shipbuilding of that scale was beyond human capacity. In truth, it was the American industrial system, not just its navy, that was winning the war. When the United States committed to a total war economy after Pearl Harbor, production surged to levels never seen before. Aircraft factories turned out thousands of planes every month. Steel mills in Pennsylvania and the Midwest poured out endless streams of plate and beam. Aluminum smelters fed the demand for lightweight airframes. Railroad networks carried parts from inland factories to coastal shipyards. This nationwide coordination meant that by the time one carrier was launched, the parts for the next two were already waiting. It was an assembly line approach to naval warfare that astonished even the Americans themselves. For Japanese planners, the implications were dire but not yet fully understood. Their shipyards, such as those at Kure and Yokosuka, could build excellent warships but only in small numbers and at a slower pace. Japan's supply of skilled labor and raw materials was limited. As the U.S. submarine campaign intensified, shipments of steel and oil from Southeast Asia became harder to protect. Meanwhile, America was not just replacing losses, it was multiplying its forces exponentially. Escort carriers, known as jeep carriers, were appearing everywhere, protecting convoys, ferrying aircraft, and providing air cover for amphibious operations. Though each was smaller and slower than a fleet carrier, collectively they gave the U.S. Navy a flexibility Japan could never match. In the skies, this growing armada transformed how battles were fought. Before, a single carrier group represented a significant gamble. Losing one could tip the balance of an entire campaign. Now, with multiple carriers operating together, American admirals could strike boldly, knowing replacements were on the way. Japanese commanders, used to dueling carrier against carrier, began to encounter entire task forces built around carriers, each with its own screen of cruisers and destroyers. Every engagement that once promised parity now risked disaster for the Imperial Navy. During the Guadalcanal campaign, the first signs of this shift emerged. American forces, though initially on the defensive, began to rely on escort carriers to supply and support their troops. The Japanese found themselves facing air cover where previously none would have existed. This trend accelerated with each new island the Americans targeted. By 1943, in the Central Solomons and New Guinea, U.S. forces were advancing under the umbrella of carrier-based air power that seemed to spring from nowhere. In Tokyo, a few analysts began to warn that the Americans were indeed building carriers on a scale far beyond Japan's capacity to counter. But these voices were drowned out by the optimism of those who still clung to the idea of a decisive naval battle. What Japan did not realize was that America's shipbuilding program was not a short-term surge but a sustained tidal wave. The Essex-class carriers were only the most visible part of it. Beneath them, dozens of escort carriers of the Casablanca and Bogue classes were being commissioned, each capable of carrying dozens of planes and dozens more support personnel. These ships required fewer resources and could be built quickly, yet they multiplied the Navy's striking power across the globe. Even as Japan's elite carrier pilots were lost in combat, America was training new squadrons at home, filling deck after deck with fresh aviators. By mid-1943, the U.S. Navy had more trained pilots than the Japanese Navy could hope to field, and the gap was widening. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders was subtle at first. They were accustomed to being outnumbered in some areas but compensated with skill, surprise, and superior tactics. Yet as the war dragged on, it became harder to deny the sheer scale of American industry. Every reconnaissance photo, every intercepted signal hinted at more carriers, more task forces, more planes. Some began to question whether Japan's cherished doctrine of quality over quantity could survive such a contest. But changing doctrine in the middle of a war is like turning a battleship. It takes time and consensus. Time was the one resource Japan no longer had. Meanwhile, on the American home front, the war effort had become a unifying cause. War bonds financed expansion, propaganda encouraged production, and communities across the country celebrated the launch of each new ship. Workers took pride in their contribution to the fleet. Many of these workers were women, African Americans, and immigrants who had never before been allowed into the skilled trades. Now they were riveters, welders, and crane operators, turning out the vessels that would carry American power across the oceans. This massive mobilization created a social and economic transformation as profound as the military one. Japanese leaders, insulated from these realities by censorship and their own prejudices, could not imagine that an entire society could be mobilized so effectively. By late 1943, American carriers were no longer just replacing losses, they were forming entirely new task forces. Operations in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands demonstrated how far the Navy had come. Multiple carrier groups struck simultaneously, supported by amphibious landings and long-range bombers. Each operation brought more Japanese bases under siege, more supply lines cut, and more airfields rendered useless. Japanese commanders who once scoffed at America's supposed carrier fantasies now found themselves facing a two-ocean navy unlike anything in history. Yet, even as evidence mounted, some in Japan's high command still believed the Americans would falter. They argued that mass production would lead to inferior ships and poorly trained crews. They placed their hopes in a final, climactic engagement, one that would inflict catastrophic losses on the U.S. fleet and force negotiations. But the logic of industrial warfare does not bend so easily to hope. America was not just building ships, it was building a system of logistics, training, and replacement that could sustain losses indefinitely. Each battle Japan planned as decisive turned instead into another step in a relentless advance. The scale of the transformation was breathtaking. From 1942 to 1944, the U.S. Navy commissioned more than 100 aircraft carriers of all types. Not all were fleet carriers, many were escorts and light carriers. But to Japanese commanders looking out from their island outposts, the distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was that wherever they turned, there seemed to be American flight decks on the horizon. Each one represented dozens of planes, trained pilots, and the capacity to project power into previously safe waters. It was an oceanic net closing around Japan, and with each passing month, the gaps grew smaller. By the end of 1943, the myth of American incapacity had begun to crack. Reports from frontline officers painted a grim picture. Yet, changing Japan's grand strategy was nearly impossible. Its industrial base could not be expanded quickly enough, its pilot training pipeline was already exhausted, and its navy was locked into a pattern of attritional losses. The Americans, by contrast, were still ascending. The 100 carriers that had once been a joke in Tokyo were now taking physical form across the Pacific. The stage was set for the great carrier battles of 1944, where this new reality would be revealed in full daylight. By the dawn of 1944, the United States Navy had crossed an invisible threshold. The handful of carriers that had survived Pearl Harbor had been multiplied many times over. Shipyards that only a few years earlier produced merchant ships and passenger liners were now launching warships with astonishing regularity. Japanese commanders, once dismissive of American capacity, were beginning to receive detailed intelligence reports of entire carrier task forces forming in the Central Pacific. Yet many still struggled to grasp the scale. In Tokyo war rooms, maps bristled with colored pins marking American advances, but the pins did not capture the full story. Behind each advance was a vast logistical network and an ever-growing fleet of carriers delivering air power to wherever it was needed. The turning point was the Central Pacific Campaign. The U.S. Navy's strategy, guided by Admiral Chester Nimitz and his staff, focused on a relentless leapfrog across the ocean toward Japan itself. Rather than engage every Japanese stronghold, the Americans targeted key islands to serve as forward bases. Each leap forward was supported by waves of carrier-based aircraft, striking enemy airfields and shipping before Marines or soldiers went ashore. Japanese garrisons, once thought secure behind miles of ocean, found themselves bombarded from the sky and isolated from resupply. The carriers were the essential element in this new style of war. They allowed the Americans to project power without needing nearby bases, creating floating airfields that moved with the fleet. In February 1944, Operation Hailstone struck Truk Lagoon, the so-called Gibraltar of the Pacific. This massive Japanese naval and air base was supposed to be impregnable. Instead, American carriers launched hundreds of aircraft in a two-day assault that destroyed dozens of ships and hundreds of planes. Truk was rendered useless as a forward base. For Japanese commanders, the attack on Truk was a revelation. It showed that no matter how distant or well-defended a base might seem, American carriers could reach it and overwhelm it. This was not a one-off raid but the expression of a new strategic reality. The U.S. Navy could mount major carrier operations at will again and again because its industrial base guaranteed replacements in ships, planes, and pilots. The appearance of the Essex-class carriers in force was central to this shift. These ships were larger, faster, and more capable than anything Japan had afloat. Each carried a powerful air group of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. Equipped with modern radar, better anti-aircraft guns, and efficient deck operations, The Essex-class could launch and recover aircraft more quickly, maintaining a relentless tempo of strikes. Japanese commanders noted bitterly that their own carrier fleet, though formidable on paper, was shrinking with each engagement and could not be replaced at the same rate. Even when Japan managed to launch new carriers, such as the Taiho, they were too few and too late to match the American tide. Beyond the fleet carriers, the proliferation of escort carriers transformed the balance of power at sea. These smaller, slower ships served as the eyes and shields of the U.S. Navy, escorting convoys, providing close air support for amphibious landings and hunting submarines. They freed the big carriers to concentrate on offensive operations. By 1944, the U.S. Navy operated entire groups of escort carriers, each with its own destroyer screen. For Japanese submariners, who had once prowled the shipping lanes with relative impunity, this was a nightmare. Air cover now reached far into the ocean, and every convoy seemed to have its own miniature airfield overhead. Japanese supply lines grew more tenuous with each passing month. Another aspect often overlooked was the training pipeline. By mid-1944, the United States had trained tens of thousands of naval aviators, mechanics, and deck crews. Dedicated training carriers off the U.S. coast allowed new pilots to practice landings and takeoffs before heading into combat. Japan, by contrast, had no such capacity. Its elite pre-war aviators had been decimated in earlier battles, and replacements received only rudimentary instruction. This meant that even when Japan put a new carrier to sea, its air group was often inexperienced and ill-prepared. American carriers, by contrast, deployed with full complements of trained personnel, backed by reserves waiting stateside. This disparity in human capital mirrored the disparity in ships and planes. As the Americans advanced through the Marshall Islands and toward the Marianas, Japanese high command began preparing for the decisive confrontation they had long envisioned. They concentrated what carriers they had left, along with battleships and cruisers, to challenge the U.S. fleet. They hoped that superior tactics and the new, longer-ranged Mitsubishi A-6M50s and Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers would offset American numbers. But by this stage, the carrier war had become a numbers game as much as a tactical duel. For every Japanese carrier, the Americans could field several, each with more planes, better radar, and thicker anti-aircraft screens. The 100 carriers that had once seemed impossible were now a visible reality, sailing toward the Philippine Sea. The build-up to the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 illustrated this shift. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, included 15 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Opposing them, the Japanese mobile fleet under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had 9 carriers, but their air groups were understrength and their pilots green. American reconnaissance spotted the Japanese fleet early, and carrier aircraft struck with devastating effect. The ensuing battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because of the lopsided loss ratios. Japanese carrier aviation was effectively destroyed as a major offensive force. Even if new carriers could be built, Japan no longer had the pilots to fill them. For American sailors and aviators, this moment marked a vindication of their massive industrial and training efforts. For Japanese commanders, it was a shattering blow. The dream of a decisive battle had come true, but in a form they could not have imagined. Instead of inflicting crippling losses on the U.S. Navy, they had suffered a defeat from which they would never recover. Yet the carriers kept coming. As soon as one operation ended, another began. The tempo of American offensives was relentless, made possible by the production lines back home. The psychological impact of this new reality on Japanese commanders was profound. Many had entered the war believing Japan held a qualitative edge that would balance American quantity. Now they saw that quantity had its own quality, especially when combined with technological innovation and disciplined training. Reports from surviving officers painted a bleak picture. American carriers operating in groups so large they seemed to blot out the horizon, endless waves of planes attacking from dawn to dusk, and anti-aircraft fire so dense it was like flying into a wall of steel. Some Japanese officers began to realize that the war at sea had become unwinnable, but their warnings went unheeded by a leadership still committed to total victory or death. Meanwhile, the American public, largely shielded from the brutal details of the fighting, followed the progress of the Pacific Campaign with maps in newspapers and newsreels in theaters. They saw headlines announcing new landings, new victories, and new ships launched. Few understood the full scale of the carrier fleet being assembled, but they knew America was on the offensive. Each new carrier named in the press symbolized another step toward victory. For workers in the shipyards, the sight of their ships on the newsreels was a source of pride and purpose. They were building more than steel hulls. They were building a future in which the Pacific would no longer be dominated by Japanese militarism. Thus, by the middle of 1944, the reality of American naval power had surpassed even the boldest predictions. The 100 carriers figure that had once been mocked in Tokyo was no longer a theoretical number. It was an oceanic fact, a network of floating airbases extending American reach thousands of miles across the Pacific. Japanese commanders who had once scoffed at the idea now faced it as their daily reality. The stage was set for the final campaigns of the war, where the full weight of this industrial and military juggernaut would crash down upon the Japanese Empire. By late 1944, the U.S. Navy had become something the world had never seen before, a mobile air force on an oceanic scale. The Japanese commanders who had doubted America's ability to build even a fraction of the rumored 100 carriers now confronted a hard truth. Across the Central and Western Pacific, task forces formed, split, and reformed with astonishing speed, each built around multiple carriers, each capable of launching hundreds of sorties per day. This was no longer the same Navy that had been ambushed at Pearl Harbor. It was an entirely new organism, born from America's industrial power and hardened by 2 years of relentless combat. The Philippines became the proving ground for this transformation. In October 1944, the U.S. launched the invasion of Leyte, aiming to cut Japan's lifeline to its southern resource areas. Japanese high command, desperate to halt the American advance, assembled what remained of its fleet for a do-or-die counterattack. This led to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. Here, the full weight of American carrier power came into play. The Japanese plan, complex and risky, sought to lure away the U.S. carriers with a decoy force while striking at the vulnerable invasion fleet. But American intelligence and radar gave them the edge, and when the battle unfolded, the sheer number of American carriers overwhelmed the Japanese effort. At Leyte Gulf, American escort carriers played a pivotal role. These so-called jeep carriers were not designed for fleet actions, yet they proved decisive. In the battle off Samar, a small group of escort carriers and their destroyer escorts faced off against a much larger Japanese force of battleships and cruisers. Despite being outgunned, the American ships fought fiercely, launching continuous air strikes and torpedo attacks that confused and battered the Japanese fleet. This desperate action, known as one of the Navy's finest hours, underscored the versatility and resilience of the carrier system America had built. Even the smallest carriers could deliver blows far beyond their tonnage. The Japanese commanders watching this unfold were stunned. Their assumptions about American weakness, about the limits of mass production, had been shattered. Instead of a single decisive battle that would cripple the U.S. Navy, they faced an adversary that could afford to lose ships and planes and still press the attack. Every carrier sunk seemed to be replaced by 2 more. Every squadron destroyed was filled again with fresh pilots and new aircraft. Japan's own fleet, by contrast, was irreplaceable. Losses in ships, pilots, and fuel could not be made good. By the end of Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Another factor that magnified American carrier power was logistics. Floating supply depots, oilers, and repair ships moved with the fleet, allowing carriers to stay at sea for months at a time. Japan had no comparable system. Its carriers were tied to distant bases for fuel and maintenance, limiting their operational flexibility. The American fleet could now strike anywhere, anytime, refueling and rearming from its own mobile infrastructure. This ability to sustain operations across vast distances turned the Pacific into an American-controlled battle space. Japanese commanders, accustomed to fighting near their own bases, found themselves outmaneuvered not only tactically but strategically. Technological innovation also played its part. American carriers introduced new types of aircraft, such as the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, and the Grumman TBF Avenger, each superior to the planes Japan was fielding. Radar-directed fighter control, improved anti-aircraft fire, and better damage control practices made American carriers harder to hit and harder to sink. Japanese pilots, already depleted and undertrained, flew into increasingly lethal defenses. Where once a single well-planned strike could cripple an enemy carrier, now massed waves of kamikaze aircraft were barely able to dent the American task forces. As the Americans pushed closer to Japan, the contrast between the two navies became even more stark. The U.S. could launch multiple large-scale amphibious assaults in rapid succession, first the Philippines, then Iwo Jima, then Okinawa, each supported by an armada of carriers. Japan, deprived of oil and materials, was forced into desperate measures, including the kamikaze campaign. While kamikazes inflicted terrible losses and psychological strain, they could not halt the American advance. Every strike group lost to suicide missions further weakened Japan's ability to defend itself. American carriers, meanwhile, absorbed the punishment and kept moving forward. For the Japanese commanders who had begun the war believing in their qualitative edge, this was a nightmare realized. They had envisioned a war of maneuver, precision strikes, and decisive engagements. Instead, they faced a war of attrition, of industrial output and relentless pressure. The 100 carriers America was said to be building had seemed an exaggeration. Now it felt like an understatement. By 1945, counting all types, fleet, light, and escort, the U.S. Navy had indeed put more than 100 carriers into service. The ocean, once Japan's shield, had become a conveyor belt of American power leading directly to its shores. The broader strategic picture was equally grim for Japan. With the Philippines in American hands, Japan's access to oil from the Dutch East Indies was cut off. Without fuel, its remaining carriers and battleships were effectively floating batteries, unable to train or maneuver. American submarines prowled the shipping lanes, sinking tankers and transports. American bombers from newly captured bases rained destruction on the home islands. Yet still the carriers came, task force after task force, tightening the noose. In this environment, Japanese naval leaders faced impossible choices. They could not match American production. They could not train pilots fast enough to replace losses. They could not rebuild their fleet. The strategic initiative had passed entirely to the United States, whose carriers now roamed the Western Pacific almost unchallenged. For every Japanese air raid launched, the Americans could mount dozens. For every ship lost, the Americans could deploy replacements. The disparity had become so great that Japanese commanders began to shift from planning offensives to simply trying to slow the inevitable. Meanwhile, on the American side, the carrier program had taken on a life of its own. Politicians and admirals alike saw it as the key to victory. Shipyards that had mastered the art of mass production continued to refine their techniques, turning out hulls with fewer man-hours, installing more powerful engines, and streamlining flight deck operations. Carriers became symbols not only of military might but also of industrial democracy, each one a floating testament to the collective effort of millions of workers back home. The scale and speed of this enterprise were unprecedented, and its impact on the war irreversible. By the time Okinawa was invaded in April 1945, the carrier armada supporting the operation dwarfed anything seen before. Hundreds of ships, thousands of planes, and tens of thousands of sailors converged on a single island. Japanese resistance was fierce, but the outcome was never in doubt. The carriers provided round-the-clock air support, suppressing enemy positions, shooting down interceptors, and keeping supply lines secure. Even the intense kamikaze attacks, which sank or damaged dozens of American ships, could not halt the operation. Every damaged carrier was patched up and returned to service. Every lost plane was replaced. The juggernaut rolled on. For Japanese commanders, the sight of this armada was the final confirmation of what they had once denied. America had not only built 100 carriers, it had built an entire system of war that could deliver those carriers, supply them, protect them, and fill their decks with aircraft and pilots. The myth of American industrial weakness had been replaced by the reality of overwhelming power. The ocean that had once been a moat protecting Japan had become a highway of invasion. Soon, the carriers would be in range of the home islands themselves, launching strikes that brought the war directly to Japan's cities. Thus, by late 1944 and into 1945, the transformation was complete. The impossible had become real. The Japanese commanders who had scoffed at America's ambitions were now living with the consequences. Their fleets lay shattered, their bases bombed, their pilots gone. Against them moved an armada without precedent, an armada built not on bluff but on steel, sweat, and industrial genius. The war at sea was decided, and the carriers had been the instrument of that decision. By the summer of 1945, the carriers of the U.S. Navy had become not just instruments of war but the very embodiment of American power. They were everywhere, in the Philippine Sea, off Okinawa, striking the Japanese home islands themselves. To Japanese commanders who had begun the war convinced of their superiority, the sight was staggering. America had not only built 100 carriers but had built the infrastructure, the training, and the doctrine to make them effective. This was more than steel hulls. It was a floating industrial complex at sea, producing air raids with the precision of a factory assembly line. Every day, planes lifted off and returned, refueled, rearmed, and lifted off again, an endless cycle that ground down Japan's remaining defenses. The campaign against the Japanese home islands was the final proof of this new reality. Beginning in early 1945, American carriers launched strikes directly against Tokyo, Yokosuka, Kobe, and other industrial centers. Japanese commanders who had once seen their homeland as untouchable now watched as carrier-based planes roared overhead, bombing airfields, railways, and shipyards. Even as B-29 bombers flew from distant bases, the carriers brought tactical air power right to Japan's doorstep. They suppressed any attempt to contest the skies, destroyed what remained of the Japanese Navy, and cut the last threads of supply and communication. For the first time in history, a naval air arm had reached into the heart of an enemy nation on such a scale. Japanese defenses grew increasingly desperate. With fuel scarce and pilots untrained, the Imperial Navy could not mount conventional strikes. Instead, they turned to the kamikaze tactic, sending pilots on one-way missions to crash into American ships. These attacks were terrifying and deadly, sinking or damaging dozens of vessels and killing thousands of sailors. Yet the carriers, protected by screens of destroyers and cruisers and bristling with anti-aircraft guns, survived the onslaught. Damage control teams worked tirelessly, patching flight decks and restoring operations within hours. For every carrier knocked out temporarily, several more pressed forward. The kamikaze campaign, intended to break American morale, only underscored the resilience of the carrier fleet. Behind this resilience lay a vast support network. Fleet oilers, ammunition ships, hospital ships, and floating dry docks moved with the task forces, enabling carriers to operate continuously without returning to distant ports. Aircraft replacements were ferried out from the mainland by escort carriers. Pilots rotated in and out, keeping squadrons fresh. This logistical ballet was invisible to most observers but essential to sustaining the offensive. Japanese commanders, who lacked anything comparable, could only watch as their enemy maintained a tempo of operations they could not match. Every day, more American planes appeared over their skies, more bombs fell on their factories, more ships closed in on their coasts. The human dimension of the carrier war was equally striking. American pilots who had joined the Navy in 1942 or 1943 now had hundreds of combat hours. They knew their planes, their tactics, and their crews. They worked with radar operators and anti-aircraft gunners as parts of a single system. Japanese pilots, by contrast, were often flying their first and only missions. The loss of veteran instructors and the lack of training fuel meant that new recruits had little more than classroom knowledge before being sent into battle. This imbalance turned every engagement into a lopsided contest. Even when Japanese planes managed to launch, they were intercepted, outmaneuvered, and destroyed by more experienced American flyers. As the war neared its end, American carriers also played a psychological role. Their presence off the Japanese coast signaled that the empire's final defense line had been breached. No longer confined to bases on remote islands, the carriers now struck wherever they pleased. Cities burned, warships sank, and rail networks shattered under their relentless attacks. Japanese leaders faced mounting pressure from their own people, who could see and hear the air raids. Each strike carried not only bombs but a message: the ocean could no longer protect Japan. The once unthinkable had happened. The enemy was at the gates, delivered not by battleships but by vast floating airfields. The scale of production behind the carriers remained astonishing even in 1945. American shipyards continued to launch new hulls even as existing ones were pounding Japan. Newer designs improved armor, flight deck operations, and anti-aircraft capabilities. Pilots trained on advanced aircraft like the F-8F Bearcat and the early jet-powered F-H Phantom, ready for deployment had the war continued. This momentum meant that even if Japan had somehow destroyed a dozen American carriers, more would have appeared within months. For Japanese commanders, this was the ultimate nightmare, a foe whose strength seemed inexhaustible. The final naval actions of the war showed how completely the balance had shifted. In July 1945, American carriers launched strikes against the remnants of the Japanese fleet in Kure and the Inland Sea. Battleships and cruisers that had once symbolized Japanese naval might were sunk at anchor or left as hulks. Aircraft factories and arsenals were obliterated. Japan's maritime lifelines were severed. There was no longer any meaningful naval opposition. The carriers had achieved what battleships never could: complete control of the sea and the sky, projecting power directly into the enemy's heartland. This overwhelming force also shaped Allied strategy after the war. Planners in Washington began to see the carrier as the primary instrument of power projection in the post-war world. The lessons learned in the Pacific would define naval doctrine for decades to come. The Japanese had demonstrated at Pearl Harbor the striking power of carriers. The Americans had taken that concept and scaled it beyond imagination. 100 carriers were not just a wartime anomaly but a glimpse of the future. Naval power was no longer about a few capital ships but about flexible, mobile air power capable of shaping entire campaigns. For the Japanese commanders who survived the war, the memory of America's carriers became a symbol of their defeat. In interrogations and post-war writings, many admitted they had underestimated American industry and resolve. They had believed Japan's head start in naval aviation would guarantee superiority. Instead, they had encountered a nation capable of mobilizing its economy, training its people, and sustaining its forces across an ocean. The carriers were the most visible expression of that mobilization. They were also the instrument by which Japan's maritime empire was dismantled, base by base, fleet by fleet, until nothing remained but isolated garrisons and burning cities. Even as atomic bombs loomed over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the carriers continued their operations. They flew combat air patrols, bombed rail lines, and supported the final stages of the war. Had an invasion of Japan been necessary, they would have formed the backbone of the assault, delivering air cover and close support to hundreds of thousands of troops. Japanese commanders knew this. They had watched as Okinawa fell despite fierce resistance. They had watched as the Philippines were liberated, Iwo Jima captured, and the skies over Tokyo filled with American planes. The war at sea was lost, and with it, the ability to defend the homeland. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the carriers had written a new chapter in military history. They had transformed naval warfare from a duel of surface ships to a contest of mobile air power. They had turned the vast distances of the Pacific from an obstacle into an advantage. They had proven that industrial capacity, when combined with strategic vision, could overcome even the most determined opponent. For Japanese commanders, the lesson was bitter. Disbelief in America's capacity had been fatal. The 100 carriers were not a myth, not a bluff, but a reality that had ground down an empire. In the closing months of World War II, as Japan's defeat became inevitable, the American carrier fleet reached a level of dominance that defied even the wildest pre-war predictions. What had begun as a handful of carriers limping out of Pearl Harbor had become an armada spanning the horizon. By August 1945, More than 100 carriers of various classes were in active service. Fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers, supported by thousands of other ships and aircraft. This was not simply an oversized navy, it was a floating system of industrial-scale air power, capable of reshaping entire theaters of war. Japanese commanders who had once mocked the idea of such a fleet now faced its consequences every day in the skies over their homeland. The most striking thing about the U.S. carrier force at this stage was its self-sufficiency. Mobile repair ships patched up damaged hulls, floating dry docks allowed carriers to be serviced at sea, replenishment ships delivered fuel, bombs, and spare parts. This meant that the U.S. Navy could conduct operations for months without ever returning to a home port. Japanese commanders had no equivalent capability. Their fleet was tethered to the home islands, increasingly paralyzed by fuel shortages and submarine attacks. This disparity turned the Pacific Ocean into a one-sided battlefield where the Americans could dictate the time, place, and terms of every engagement. Carrier-based aircraft at this stage were also markedly superior. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, the Vought F-4U Corsair, and the Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber had all matured into highly reliable and deadly platforms. Pilots flew with the support of airborne radar, coordinated intercepts, and practiced deck crews who could launch and recover planes with factory-like precision. Japanese pilots, by contrast, were often flying outdated aircraft like the Zero against overwhelming numbers. Even kamikaze pilots, flying at treetop level to evade radar, found themselves intercepted by combat air patrols or shredded by anti-aircraft fire before reaching their targets. The carrier groups had become moving fortresses, bristling with guns and planes. As American carriers drew closer to Japan's shores, their role evolved from purely military to psychological. Each new strike demonstrated not just military superiority but also the futility of resistance. Factories were bombed, rail lines cut, airfields cratered. Coastal shipping became impossible. Fishermen saw American planes overhead. Children in Tokyo suburbs watched carrier-based fighters streaking across the sky. The myth of Japan's invulnerability was broken. Japanese commanders, already grappling with the devastation wrought by B-29 bombers, now faced an enemy whose reach was effectively unlimited. Every time they prepared a defense, American carriers shifted position and struck from another direction. This mobility gave the United States a strategic flexibility Japan could not hope to match. If one area became too heavily defended, the carriers moved elsewhere, hitting a softer target or circling behind to cut off supply lines. The vast distances of the Pacific, once a shield for Japan, became a trap. Japanese commanders realized that with their merchant fleet sunk and their oil supplies dwindling, even retreating to the home islands offered no safety. The carriers were always there, just beyond the horizon, ready to launch the next wave. The phrase, "the fleet that came to stay," was no exaggeration. It was a daily reality for anyone in Japan looking out to sea. Another crucial factor was the American mastery of coordination between services. By 1945, carrier aviation worked hand in glove with submarines, surface fleets, and land-based bombers. Carrier strikes softened targets for amphibious invasions, submarines intercepted fleeing ships, battleships and cruisers provided bombardment, and Army air forces bombed from high altitude. This integrated approach meant that Japanese commanders faced not isolated attacks but a synchronized, multi-pronged assault. They could not plug one hole without three more opening elsewhere. The carriers were the most visible component of this assault but also the most flexible, able to shift focus at a moment's notice. Japanese naval leaders who survived the war later described their sense of helplessness. They had entered the conflict believing in a doctrine of decisive battle: lure the enemy across the Pacific, strike his fleet in one massive engagement, and win a victory so great it would force a negotiated peace. But the American carrier fleet had turned that doctrine upside down. Instead of one decisive battle, there were dozens of hammer blows, each delivered with overwhelming force, each eroding Japan's ability to respond. Even when the Japanese tried to mass their forces, as at the Philippine Sea or Leyte Gulf, they found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and outproduced. By the summer of 1945, The carriers were striking not just military targets but the infrastructure of the Japanese state itself. They hit rail yards, power plants, munitions factories, and shipbuilding centers. They supported mine-laying operations that bottled up Japan's remaining ships in harbor. They destroyed coastal defenses in preparation for a possible invasion of Kyushu. Every strike tightened the noose. Japanese commanders who had once believed their navy could shield the homeland now saw that shield shattered, its fragments lying on the ocean floor. The carriers were no longer a rumor or a distant threat, they were an occupying presence offshore. The human toll of this unrelenting campaign weighed heavily on Japan's leadership. Reports from the front described not just losses of ships and planes but also the collapse of morale among sailors and aircrews. Pilots went to their deaths knowing their missions were futile. Ship captains sailed without hope of resupply. Even civilian populations began to grasp that the war was unwinnable. Yet the leadership in Tokyo hesitated to surrender, clinging to the hope of a negotiated peace or a miraculous reversal. Each day that passed brought new strikes from the carriers, new flames rising over cities, new wrecks littering harbors. The scale of destruction was unprecedented in naval warfare. At the same time, American carriers were already looking beyond the current war. The Navy tested new tactics, experimented with jet aircraft, and refined replenishment techniques. Lessons learned in the Pacific were codified into doctrine that would define naval power for the rest of the century. The Japanese had pioneered carrier warfare at Pearl Harbor, the Americans had perfected it on a scale no one had imagined. The 100 carriers were not just a wartime phenomenon but the birth of a new era in which naval air power would dominate global strategy. For Japanese commanders witnessing the endgame, the final realization was both personal and national. Their disbelief at American capacity had led them to underestimate their enemy. Their early victories had blinded them to the long-term reality of industrial warfare. By 1945, those miscalculations had cost them their fleet, their empire, and their chance at victory. The carriers symbolized this failure more than any other weapon. Each one represented a piece of steel America had forged, a pilot it had trained, a doctrine it had tested. Together they were an irresistible force that rolled across the Pacific and crushed everything in its path. When the Emperor finally announced Japan's surrender in August 1945, many of the carrier task forces were still at sea, preparing for new strikes or rehearsing for the invasion of Kyushu. They did not know their war was over until the radio broadcasts reached them. Some sailors reportedly wept with relief, others felt disbelief. For months they had been operating at a tempo no navy had ever sustained, certain the fighting would continue into 1946. Instead, their overwhelming power had achieved what it was designed to do: force the enemy to capitulate without an invasion. The carriers had done their job, and in doing so, they had changed the nature of war forever. In the months that followed Japan's surrender, the scale of what the United States had accomplished at sea came fully into view. Sailors returning home brought stories of fleets so large they stretched beyond the horizon, of air groups so vast that flight decks felt like city streets, of replenishment ships arriving with clockwork precision. For Japanese commanders, now prisoners or witnesses to the post-war occupation, these accounts confirmed what they had seen firsthand. America had achieved something unprecedented. It had built more than 100 aircraft carriers and had mastered the art of using them as a single, integrated instrument of war. This was not simply a naval success but a transformation in global power. The psychological journey of the Japanese high command mirrored the physical destruction of their fleet. Before Pearl Harbor, they had believed they possessed an elite force of pilots, ships, and doctrine that would allow them to win a short, decisive war. They assumed America's industrial base was soft and inefficient, unable to produce complex warships on a large scale. Each early victory reinforced this belief. But as the war dragged on and American carriers kept appearing in greater numbers, the narrative shifted from disbelief to alarm, then to despair. By 1945, many senior officers privately admitted they had underestimated their opponent. The 100 carriers, once a punchline, had become the grinding engine of their defeat. American officers, by contrast, viewed their carrier fleet as a validation of their nation's values. Mass production, democratic mobilization, and technological innovation had combined to produce a weapon system of unparalleled flexibility. The shipyards that had launched these carriers employed men and women from every walk of life. The pilots who flew from their decks represented every state in the Union. To them, the carriers were more than ships, they were floating embodiments of national unity and industrial capacity. This self-image would shape American strategy for decades, embedding the carrier as the centerpiece of U.S. naval doctrine and foreign policy. The lessons of the Pacific War were studied obsessively in the post-war years. Analysts concluded that carriers had not merely supplemented battleships but replaced them as the primary capital ship. Mobility, striking power, and the ability to project air dominance anywhere on Earth were the decisive factors. The Japanese, who had pioneered carrier tactics at Pearl Harbor, had never imagined the scale to which those tactics could be applied. American planners did, and in doing so they rewrote the rules of naval warfare. This realization spread quickly around the world. Every major navy began to reconsider its force structure, and aircraft carriers became the new symbol of great power status. For Japanese commanders reflecting on their defeat, the critical error lay in assuming that technology and training alone could offset industrial disparity. In the early 1940s, Japan could build 1 or 2 carriers a year. America could build a dozen. Japan could train hundreds of pilots annually. America could train thousands. Japan could deploy a few support ships. America built entire mobile logistics groups. This asymmetry was not immediately visible in the first year of the war, but by 1944 it had become overwhelming. The carriers, as the most visible manifestation of this asymmetry, told the story better than any statistic. They kept coming, battle after battle, until resistance collapsed. The symbolism of the 100 carriers extended beyond Japan's defeat. In Europe, Allied leaders took note of America's ability to mobilize across oceans. In Moscow, Soviet planners began to study carrier warfare, considering how such power could be countered or emulated. In London, British admirals debated whether to maintain their own carrier force or rely on American support. The post-war world was being shaped not just by atomic bombs but by the realization that naval air power, deployed at scale, could decide conflicts before they reached the beaches. Japan had been the test case, and the results were clear. At the human level, the carrier war left a deep imprint on those who fought it. American sailors remembered the endless flight operations, the constant hum of engines, the tension of kamikaze alerts, and the sight of their comrades' planes returning damaged or not at all. Japanese sailors remembered watching waves of American aircraft descending like a moving wall of steel and flame. Pilots on both sides pushed their machines to the limit, often in brutal conditions. Yet the system favored the Americans. More planes, more pilots, more carriers, more fuel, more food. Every disadvantage Japan faced magnified the psychological toll of fighting an enemy whose strength only seemed to grow. Even in surrender, Japanese naval officers expressed a mixture of admiration and dread for the American carrier fleet. They spoke of its discipline, its speed, its logistical prowess, and its ability to recover from setbacks almost instantly. They compared it to a living creature, an organism that absorbed losses, adapted, and struck again. This perception was not far from the truth. The U.S. Navy had designed its carrier operations as a system, with redundancy built in at every level. No single battle, no single blow could cripple it. That resilience was the essence of its power, and it became a model for how America would fight future wars. The carriers also represented a moral and strategic dilemma. Their strikes inflicted enormous destruction on Japanese cities and military installations. Civilians bore much of the suffering. Yet from the American perspective, this was the alternative to a bloody invasion of the home islands. The carriers had made it possible to deliver sustained air attacks without seizing every island in between, shortening the war and, arguably, saving lives in the long run. This debate would continue in post-war discussions, but for the men who served aboard the carriers, the mission had been clear: break Japan's capacity to wage war and force its surrender. As the 1940s ended, the image of the American carrier force remained etched in the minds of those who had seen it. Japanese commanders who testified at war crimes tribunals or wrote memoirs often began their accounts with stories of carrier raids, the moment when they realized the tide had turned, the moment when disbelief gave way to recognition. They described the horizon filled with ships, the skies dark with planes, and the growing sense of inevitability. These memories became part of Japan's post-war narrative, a cautionary tale about underestimating an opponent and overestimating one's own capabilities. The legacy of the 100 carriers extended into the Cold War. When crises erupted in Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere, it was often American carriers that arrived first, projecting power and signaling resolve. The system built during World War II had proven so effective that it became a permanent feature of U.S. strategy. Japanese commanders who had once mocked the idea had, inadvertently, helped demonstrate its necessity. By trying to win a decisive naval war in the Pacific, they had provoked the very transformation that defeated them. In this sense, the carriers were not just America's victory but Japan's unwitting creation. Thus, as the world moved on from the devastation of World War II, the image of American carriers steaming across the Pacific remained a potent reminder of what industrial power, strategic vision, and technological innovation could achieve. For Japanese commanders reflecting in prison cells or in retirement, the lesson was seared into memory. Never again assume an adversary cannot do the impossible. The 100 carriers were not a myth, not an exaggeration, but a living force that had reshaped the war and the world. In the aftermath of the war, as Japan rebuilt from the ruins and the United States adjusted to its new role as a global superpower, the story of the 100 carriers became more than a wartime statistic. It became a legend, a case study in what happens when a nation harnesses its industry, its people, and its ideas to meet an existential challenge. Japanese commanders who had once dismissed the idea now spoke of it with a kind of awe. They had seen firsthand how America had taken the concept of the aircraft carrier and elevated it into an entire system of warfighting, logistics, and strategy. They had learned that disbelief in an opponent's capacity is a dangerous luxury in war. The carriers did more than win battles. They rewrote the very geometry of the Pacific War. Before them, distance had been Japan's ally. After them, distance meant nothing. The ability to launch air power from floating decks hundreds of miles offshore allowed the United States to leapfrog islands, isolate garrisons, and bring the war directly to the Japanese homeland. No army could maneuver fast enough to escape this reach, and no fleet could hide long enough to recover from it. This was the heart of America's advantage: mobility married to mass production, strategy fused with technology. It was a formula that outstripped anything Japan could counter. For Japanese naval thinkers reflecting after the war, this was perhaps the hardest lesson. They had begun the conflict believing in a qualitative edge: better pilots, better tactics, and the element of surprise. They had assumed that the Americans were too soft, too decentralized, and too divided to wage a long, grinding war. But the carriers showed otherwise. They showed a country that could mobilize, innovate, and sustain an unprecedented level of effort across an ocean. They showed that a democratic system, far from being weak, could be the strongest foundation for total war when properly focused. In that sense, the carriers were not just warships, they were political and industrial statements. The 100 carriers also changed Japan's own post-war trajectory. As the country demilitarized and focused on economic recovery, it looked to technology and production rather than conquest. Former naval officers went into industry, applying lessons learned from logistics and engineering to peaceful purposes. Shipyards once used for carriers began turning out merchant vessels. The memory of American carriers on the horizon, unstoppable, unanswerable, shaped Japan's decision to pursue alliances rather than militarism. Even decades later, when Japan began to field helicopter destroyers and small carriers of its own, they did so as part of a defensive posture aligned with the very power that had once overwhelmed them. For the United States, the carriers became the centerpiece of its Cold War strategy. The same decks that had launched raids on Tokyo now launched reconnaissance flights off the Soviet coast and humanitarian missions in disaster zones. The Navy refined its replenishment system, introduced nuclear-powered carriers, and adapted to jet aircraft. The 100 carriers of World War II gave way to a smaller but far more capable force, each ship more powerful than any wartime predecessor. Yet the basic idea, that a carrier group could project power anywhere on Earth, remained unchanged. This was the enduring legacy of the Pacific War. From a storytelling perspective, the saga of the carriers contains all the elements of an epic: overconfidence and hubris, innovation and adaptation, tragedy and triumph. It is a story about ships, yes, but also about people. The shipyard workers who riveted the hulls, the deck crews who fueled the planes, the pilots who flew into combat, the admirals who planned the campaigns, and the ordinary sailors who kept the vast machine running. It is about Japanese officers confronting a new reality, and about American officers seizing an opportunity to reshape the battlefield. It is about how the industrial age, when fully mobilized, could change not just the outcome of a war but the nature of warfare itself. For Japanese commanders at the end of their lives, the memory of American carriers remained vivid. They spoke of the thunder of engines, the endless formations of planes, the glint of sunlight on steel decks. They remembered their own disbelief slowly turning to fear and finally to resignation. They had fought bravely, often desperately, but they had fought under a false assumption about their enemy's capacity. In interviews and memoirs, many of them urged future generations never to underestimate an opponent's potential, no matter how implausible it seems at first. This was the moral of their defeat, and the carriers were its symbol. Today, when we look back at that era, the 100 carriers stand as a testament to what is possible in moments of national crisis, for better or worse. They demonstrate the power of organization, innovation, and collective effort. They also remind us of the cost: tens of thousands of lives lost, cities destroyed, and oceans littered with wrecks. The carriers were both instruments of victory and harbingers of a new, more total kind of warfare. Understanding them helps us understand not only how World War II was won but also how the modern world was shaped. And now, as you've followed this journey from disbelief to overwhelming reality, you've seen how the story of the Japanese commanders and the American carriers is not just history but a lesson. It's about vision, production, and the danger of underestimation. It's about how a single concept, scaled up with determination, can change the balance of power. If you found this story as compelling as we have in telling it, remember to show your support, subscribe to our channel, share this video with others who love history, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us keep bringing these hidden stories of history to life. Because history is not just dates and battles. It's decisions and consequences, assumptions and realities. The Japanese commanders once believed America could not build 100 carriers. By the end, they were watching those carriers darken their skies. That's the story we've told here. A story of disbelief, transformation, and the relentless power of an idea brought to life. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. Stay tuned for more stories from the past that still echo in our present, and never forget the lessons they hold.